cooperation apparently is undergoing difficulty. The Trump new administration coming in. Nevertheless, technology cross-licensing and the supply chain nestling in areas such as photovoltaics and the EVs have formed a de facto, what might be called the climate community of shared interest. So what do you think of this market-driven industrial coupling? Can it evolve into a balance against the political, cyclical fluctuations and provide a template for solutions that transcend ideology for the green transition in developing countries?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the global commitment to drive clean air, clean water cannot be denied. And in fact, in most of the countries of the world, I mean, certainly in Europe is not going to back off at all, and China is not, and a lot of the developing countries are not. So the U.S. is kind of an island right now. So Trump has come out and basically said, I want to stop with charging stations. we're going to eliminate all of the subsidies for EVs. So that's his way of kind of lashing out. Anything he can do to assert his power feeds him. And that's a lot of what he's doing there. So it's not based on a long-term rationale. He thinks he's going to bring the auto business back to the U.S., and it's just not going to happen. And the U.S. is far behind on EVs compared to others, but the rest of the world isn't. So I think that there will be a short-term setback as the U.S., which is obviously a big economic player, withdraws its investment in those areas. But the collective weight and momentum of EVs and renewable energy and those kinds of issues is not going away. The demand is too strong and too grounded in China. It's grounded in Europe. It's grounded in most of the developing countries. So this will be a blip on the radar screen, and where we maybe lost a year or a year and a half or something like that. But the train has left the station. It's not going to stop. And the idea we're going to go back to combustion engines is ridiculous.
Let me get to your book. So your book, Powerful Difference Equal, discusses about the fundamental differences in governance culture and the economic models between China and the United States, challenge common Western misconceptions about China. So among all those misconceptions mentioned in your book, which one do you think is the most misleading? And how can China and the United States bridge this gap and coexist in a what we might call a competitive, cooperative manner?
Yeah. Well, there's so many misconceptions, it's kind of hard to know where to start, because although I think it's very important to think about who holds the misconceptions. The people in the U.S. who really understand China are the businesses active in China. So you don't have to explain the difference between contracts and Guangxi if you're talking to a major multinational in the U.S. who's been doing a business in China for the last 30 years. So the challenge is the people in Washington have very little understanding of China. And because Trump has created the notion, starting in Trump 1.0, that China was the evil empire that's the cause of our problems, has gotten pretty deeply seated in what I would call relatively undereducated people, and has been embraced at the Washington federal government level. But at the end of the day, it's a misconception that time will ultimately take care of. It has to, and there are a couple of dimensions to it. One is that the U.S. will come to understand that industrial policies really are the best way to build a business competitive advantage. And the evidence is so overwhelming coming out of China. And we saw, even with the CHIPS Act, a recognition that that's a way to go. A second misconception is that China doesn't really know how to innovate. But when you look at so many areas where China has been cutting edge, and if you look at what Huawei has been able to accomplish, and if you look at Deep Six, if you look at state-of-the-art EVs, if you look at high-speed rail, there's so many areas where China is already the global leader that to say all they know how to do is copy is so against the facts. Now, for undereducated people in the US, they'll buy that story, but it gets harder and harder to sell. I think another fundamental misconception, which is really basic, is because China is a, quote, communist country, the people by definition are oppressed and unhappy, which you and I know is totally ridiculous. That when you talk to Chinese people, because a lot of people in the US will say, well, I love the Chinese people, but I don't like the government. And I always say, well, you have to keep in mind that the quality of living in China has accelerated at a rate that the world has never seen over a relatively short period of time, the last 40 years. So the people look at the government, they don't agree with everything they do, but overall, they're very satisfied that they have delivered high quality standard of living for them. And therefore, to think that they're going to be unhappy and get out from under this current model is just totally naive. But that's a huge misconception, because a lot of people basically say, we just have to wait. Ultimately, the people will rebel. But that's only said by people who don't understand and haven't spent time in China.
Peter, you have dedicated over like 15 years to studying Chinese history and culture. Would you like to share with us some of your experiences? And also, since culture is so important to understand Chinese relations, do you think, except for the differences between two cultures, are there any commonalities between two cultures, or what might be called a cultural consensus between the two countries?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that the U.S. will never match China because their histories are just too different. Is that China really is a civilization state, and the U.S. really is a melting pot, and those are huge differences. So if you look at the proportion of the population in the U.S. that is Black, Hispanic, Asian, that's rapidly, when you add them up, becoming a majority, if it's not already a majority. And creating a unified country point of view is very difficult when you have people who come from very different cultures and with very different expectations. So China will always benefit from the fact that it's 93% Han. They will always benefit from the fact that Confucian values are fundamental to how China operates. So the notion of everyone having a responsibility to improve themselves through hard work and education, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of their families and the countries, is an enormous competitive strength that leads to a collective view of the world, which means common good is more important than individual good. And the reality is that will remain a competitive advantage. Now, the good news is that China has never been militaristic, and to this day is not militaristic. And I defy anyone to try to make the case otherwise with facts. You just can't. So I think the fact that China is not militaristic means that a lot of the threat that's pushed by American politicians is so wrong in terms of the reality of history that over time people will just come to understand that if you look at aggressiveness in terms of attacking, invading, and doing whatever in other countries, there are many other countries, starting with the U.S., who have been far more aggressive on that side than China has ever been. So, I'm just a believer that over time, as a lot of the short-term hysteria created by Trump fades away, people are going to increasingly realize that China is well-managed, takes care of its people, is not interested in expanding its geographic boundaries, and is not a military threat. And so, but it's not going to happen easily, it's not going to happen quickly, because you've still got not only Washington, but you've also got media in the US who are under increasing economic pressure because people just don't go to traditional media companies for news anymore. So when you look at the economics of media companies, all they can do is become increasingly sensational in their coverage, and the easiest thing to do is attack China. But when you read what they're saying about China, and if you know China, you say, that's an interesting story, has nothing to do with reality. But I think time will take care of those things, because increasingly your ability to paint a distorted picture of China gets harder and harder to do in the face of history. And frankly, China has always been a patient country. And so China's not saying we need this to happen in the next 12 months, but every year the understanding gap gets closed a little bit more. And whether it happens in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, frankly, is not a big deal. I mean, that's why I think it's important that China really focus on what it needs to do as a country to get its economic house really in order and make it sustainable, and not pay too much attention to all the noise coming out of the US, which frankly is not constructive, and China has too many strengths to worry about it.
Let's look a little bit into the future. So what do you think is the most likely scenario for China-US relations going forward in the next 5 to 10 years? Limited decoupling, a new Cold War, or peaceful coexistence? What do you think are the conditions for each of those scenarios to be happening?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that not only Trump, who really was the founder of the anti-China movement, when he goes, that will go with it. And certainly a lot of his appointments, who are frequently not qualified to do what they're doing. So I'm guessing that whatever new administration comes in, I think it's highly likely to be the Democrats, and we're going to see that for the first time with the midterms, are going to really put aside the historic distortions of the Trump administration and really look for a fresh start. And I think China will welcome that in terms of being able to sit down with thoughtful people who really, by then the evidence will be so clear that you cannot contain China from a technology point of view. So there's really no alternative but cooperation and win-wins. So I think it's inevitable that's going to happen, and I hope it happens with the next election. And I think thoughtful people will be back in charge. And I think they'll realize that this is a fool's errand to think that you can contain China. And therefore, what are they doing well? What are we doing well? The U.S. has a lot of areas where they are industry leaders as well. And so it ought to be two strong countries coming together, knowing there's no real military threat on either side, and just simply saying, we can create a situation where the sum of the parts is greater than going our own ways, and decoupling is just a totally foolish and unrealistic idea. The idea that you'd create something as powerful as AI to future generations with totally different systems and regulations is absurd. It would just be a huge additional cost to humanity for nobody's benefit. But there's been a lot written about that in the U.S. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find educated people in the U.S. who would say decoupling with China is a smart thing to do.